The sound of a soul breaking is silent. It does not crack like thunder or shatter like glass. It simply ceases to be. Ariadne felt the severance in the center of her chest, a phantom thread snapping, recoiling with a violence that stole the breath from her lungs. The golden light of the ballroom, the smell of pine and expensive perfume, the clinking of crystal, it all blurred into a kaleidoscope of nausea. Across the floor, he didn't even look devastated. He looked relieved. The bond, the ancient pull of the moon, had been judged and found wanting, discarded like a withered rose in the snow. The chandeliers of the Silver Moon Pack House were not merely lights, they were accusations. Crystal teardrops suspended in the air, refracting the brilliance of 1,000 candles, illuminating every flaw in the room. For Ariadne Whitmore, they served only to highlight her own inadequacy. She stood in the shadow of a velvet curtain, her fingers twisting the fabric of her modest gray dress, trying to make herself smaller. Invisibility was her armor, silence was her shield. The Winter Solstice Ball was a riot of color, crimson silks, emerald satins, the flash of teeth and jewels. The air was thick with the scent of roasted venison, spiced wine, and the pheromones of 200 shifters posturing for status. But Ariadne smelled only him, Charles Kingsbury, the beta's son, the golden boy of the pack. He stood near the orchestra, laughing at something Valeria Stonebrook had whispered. Valeria was everything Ariadne was not, sharp, vibrant, lethal. A diamond cut to draw blood. Charles wore a tuxedo that strained against his broad shoulders, his hair a halo of sunlight even indoors. When Ariadne looked at him, the dormant bond in her chest hummed, a sweet aching song that had been building since her 18th birthday 3 days ago. Tonight, by tradition, she would approach him. Tonight, the moon would bless them. But as the clock chimed midnight, signaling the start of the mating ceremony, the hum in her chest turned into a scream. Charles ascended the dais. The room quieted, a hush of anticipation falling over the crowd. Ariadne stepped forward, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She took a breath, the scent of rain and cedar, his scent, filling her senses. "Charles," she whispered, the name tasting like hope. He looked down. His blue eyes, usually warm, were glaciers. There was no recognition in them, no answering pull. Beside him, Valeria smirked, her hand resting possessively on his forearm. "Ariadne," Charles said, his voice carrying effortlessly to the back of the room. He didn't step down to meet her. He stayed on the pedestal, looking down at the Omega who had barely spoken 10 words to him in her life. The moon goddess makes mistakes. The room gasped, a collective intake of breath that sucked the oxygen from the air. "Charles?" Ariadne's voice trembled, her knees felt like water. "I am destined for leadership," Charles declared, his gaze sweeping over the pack, ignoring the tears welling in Ariadne's wide, doe-like eyes. "I need a mate who can stand at the front lines, not one who hides in the curtains. I need strength, fire." He turned to Valeria, lifting her hand to his lips. "I choose my own destiny." He looked back at Ariadne, and the brutality of his next words was in their calmness. I, Charles Kingsbury, reject you, Ariadne Whitmore, as my mate." The pain hit her instantly, a physical blow that doubled her over. It felt as if a hand had reached into her chest and ripped out a vital organ. The bond withered, turning to ash in her veins. She gasped, clutching her stomach, falling to her knees on the polished parquet floor. Silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. No one moved to help her. To help a rejected mate was to insult the high-ranking wolf who had done the rejecting. "Go," Charles said, not unkindly, but with a finality that was worse than anger. "You don't belong here anymore, Ariadne. You are a ghost in this pack." Ariadne looked up through the curtain of her dark hair. She saw the pity in the eyes of her neighbors, the triumph in Valeria's smile, the indifference in Charles's posture. She scrambled to her feet, the soles of her shoes slipping on the floor. She didn't pack a bag. She didn't say goodbye. She turned and ran, bursting through the heavy oak doors into the biting, merciless cold of the December night. The snow was deep, reaching past her ankles, soaking through her thin shoes within minutes. Ariadne didn't feel the cold, not yet. The agony of the rejection was a fire that consumed her from the inside out. She ran until her lungs burned, until the lights of the pack house were swallowed by the dense tree line. She was an Omega. She wasn't built for endurance, nor for the harshness of the wilderness. but the instinct to flee was primal. She couldn't stay where the air tasted of his rejection. Minutes turned into hours. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by the creeping numbness of hypothermia. The wind howled through the pines, a mournful dirge that matched the emptiness in her soul. Her gray dress was torn, snagged on briars, and her skin was blue-white in the moonlight. She had crossed the valley. She realized it too late. The trees here were different, older. Their trunks were massive, twisted pillars of black wood that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. The air was still, unnaturally so. No owls hooted, no small prey scurried in the underbrush. This was the Deadlands, the territory of the Alpha King. Stories of the Alpha King were whispered in nursery rhymes to scare pups into obedience. Sebastian Ravensford, the Wolf of the North. They said he was cursed, bound by ancient laws that made him more monster than man. They said he had no pack, only an army of shadows. To trespass on his land was death. Ariadne stumbled, her foot catching on a hidden root. She fell hard, the snow biting into her cheek. She didn't have the strength to rise. Let it end, she thought, her vision blurring. Let the cold take what Charles didn't want. She closed her eyes, waiting for the peace of freezing to death. Instead, she felt a vibration in the ground, a rhythmic thrumming, heavy and purposeful. She forced her eyes open. Emerging from the darkness between the trees was a wolf. But it was no ordinary shifter. It was a behemoth, standing nearly at the height of a horse, its fur the color of obsidian, matted with ice. Its eyes were burning gold, not the warm amber of her pack, but the searing, molten gold of a predator that had forgotten mercy. Ariadne couldn't move. She could only watch as the beast prowled toward her, the snow steaming where its paws touched the ground. It lowered its massive head, sniffing her. The heat radiating from it was intoxicating. It growled, a sound like grinding tectonic plates, low and dangerous. Then, the bones shifted. The sound of cracking and reshaping filled the clearing, wet and visceral. The massive wolf dissolved into the form of a man. He was tall, towering over her prone form. He wore heavy furs and black leather, a sword strapped to his hip, an anachronism that felt terrifyingly real. His face was sharp angles and harsh lines, a scar cutting through his left eyebrow. His hair was black as a raven's wing, falling into eyes that still held the golden glow of his wolf. He looked down at her with an expression of utter disdain. "You have crossed the bloodline," he said, his voice rough, like gravel tumbling down a mountainside. "Give me one reason why I shouldn't leave you to the frost." Ariadne tried to speak, but her teeth chattered so violently she couldn't form words. A tear slipped from the corner of her eye, instantly freezing on her cheek. The king stared at the frozen tear. His nostrils flared, he inhaled sharply, and his expression shifted from disdain to something else. Confusion, rage, rejection, he murmured, the word hanging in the frozen air. "You smell of shattered bonds." He knelt, the movement fluid and predatory. He stripped off his heavy fur cloak. Before Ariadne could flinch, he wrapped it around her, the warmth of his body, heat lingering in the pelt, enveloping her. "Do not mistake this for kindness," he growled, scooping her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing. "I simply dislike trash on my lawn." Ariadne's head lolled against his chest. Beneath the leather and wool, she heard his heart. It beat slow and steady like a war drum. "Sleep," he commanded, and for the first time that night, she obeyed. Ariadne woke to the scent of wood smoke and old stone. She lay in a bed that felt vast, drowning in layers of heavy quilts and velvet throws. The room was cavernous, the ceiling lost in shadows high above. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, the logs within the size of small trees, burning with a ferocity that kept the chill at bay. She sat up, wincing. Her muscles ached, and her skin felt tight and raw. "You're awake," she gasped, pulling the blankets up to her chin. Sebastian Ravensford stood by the window, his back to her. He was dressed in a crisp white shirt and dark trousers now, looking more like a nobleman than a wild beast, but the aura of danger remained. He turned slowly. The morning light, filtered through tall, narrow windows, did not soften his features. It made him look like a statue carved from marble and regret. "Where am I?" Ariadne's voice was a rasp. "Blackwood Castle," Sebastian said. He walked toward a small table and poured a goblet of water. He moved with a prowling grace, silent on the stone floor. He extended the goblet to her. Ariadne hesitated, then took it, her fingers brushing his. A spark, sharp and static, jumped between them. She jerked back, spilling a little water. Sebastian didn't flinch, but his golden eyes narrowed. "Drink?" She drank greedily. The water was cool and sweet. "Why am I here?" she asked, lowering the goblet. You said I was trash on your lawn." "I said I dislike trash," he corrected, leaning against the bedpost, crossing his arms. The muscles in his forearms shifted under the rolled-up sleeves. "Dead bodies attract scavengers. Scavengers are noisy. I value my quiet." "I should go," Ariadne whispered, though the thought of the snow made her shudder. "My pack." "Your pack abandoned you," Sebastian stated brutally. "I smelled the severance on you, a mate rejection, and not a quiet one." He tilted his head, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Who was he?" "It doesn't matter," she said, looking down at her hands. "It matters," he countered, his voice dropping an octave. "Because now you are a rogue, a trespasser, and by the ancient laws, your life is mine to take." Ariadne looked up, fear seizing her throat. "Are you going to kill me?" Sebastian watched her. He looked at the curve of her neck, the pulse fluttering there like a trapped bird. For a moment she thought she saw hunger in his gaze, not for food, but for something deeper, something starving. Then he turned away, walking back to the fire. He picked up an iron poker and stabbed at the logs, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. "No," he said, his back to her. "Killing you would be too easy, and I'm bored." "Then let me leave." "You cannot leave," he said, and the heavy thud of the iron poker against the stone signaled the end of the discussion. "A blizzard has set in. The pass is blocked. You are stuck here, little wolf, until the ice melts." "That could be weeks," she protested. He turned, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows behind him, making him look like a demon king on his throne. "Then you had better learn to be quiet," Sebastian said. "Do not go into the west wing. Do not disturb me when I am in my study. And do not, under any circumstances, go into the crypts." "Or what?" Ariadne asked, a spark of defiance igniting in her despite her fear. "You'll kill me?" Sebastian smiled. It was not a nice smile. It was terrifying. "There are fates worse than death, Ariadne," he said, using her name for the first time. It sounded foreign on his tongue, heavy and significant. "And in this castle, we keep them all in the basement." He strode to the heavy wooden door. "Food will be brought to you. Stay in this room." "Wait!" she called out. He paused, hand on the latch. "Why?" she asked. "Why save me?" Sebastian didn't look back. "Because," he murmured, so quietly she almost didn't hear him, "I know what it is like to be discarded." The door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot, leaving Ariadne alone in the tower of the Wolf King, with the fire crackling like a warning in the hearth. The days in Blackwood Castle did not pass. They drifted, like snowbanks settling against stone. Ariadne had been a prisoner of the blizzard for a week, and in that time she had learned the geography of silence. Her room was a sanctuary of firelight and velvet, but Ariadne was an omega. Her nature was not one of stagnation. She was built to nurture, to mend, to create order from chaos. The idleness was itching under her skin, worse than the healing scratches from her flight through the woods. On the 8th day, when the wind outside had quieted to a low moan, she defied the king's orders. She slipped out of her room, her footsteps soundless on the flagstones. The castle was a labyrinth of shadows and dust. It felt abandoned, not in the way of a ruin, but in the way of a home whose master had stopped seeing it. Cobwebs draped like mourning veils over suits of armor. Dust motes danced in the shafts of cold light, piercing the arrow slits. She followed a draft that smelled of old paper and leather. It led her to a set of double doors, slightly ajar. Pushing them open, Ariadne gasped. It was a library, 2 stories high, lined with books from floor to ceiling. But it was a disaster. Piles of tomes lay toppled on the floor, scattered like victims of a struggle. A heavy desk in the center was buried under maps and broken quills. The fireplace was cold, choked with ash. It looked like a mind turned inside out. Without thinking, Ariadne moved. It was instinct. She couldn't fix her bond, she couldn't fix her life, but she could fix this. She spent hours lifting heavy volumes, dusting their spines with the hem of her ruined dress and stacking them according to subject. She cleared the desk, wiping away the grime to reveal rich mahogany. She found a broom in a corner and swept the hearth. She was so absorbed in the rhythm of the work, the simple grounding act of cleaning, that she didn't hear the door open. "I told you to stay in your room." The voice was low, vibrating through the floorboards. Ariadne froze, a leather-bound history of the Northern Wars in her hands. She turned slowly. Sebastian stood in the doorway. He'd been training, his shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing a sheen of sweat on his chest, and his hair was damp. The golden intensity of his eyes pinned her to the spot. Ariadne swallowed, her heart hammering. "I couldn't just sit there anymore. I'm sorry." Sebastian walked into the room. He didn't look at her. He looked at the room. His gaze swept over the organized shelves, the clean desk, the swept hearth. He stopped at a small table where she had placed a vase she'd found, filling it with dried winter berries from a forgotten wreath. He reached out, tracing the rim of the vase with a claw-tipped finger. "You are cleaning," he said, his voice unreadable. "It was messy," she whispered. "It was dead," he corrected. He turned to her then, closing the distance between them in 2 long strides. He loomed over her, smelling of snow, steel, and musk. It was terrifying, yet the bond, the broken, silent thing in her chest, gave a strange phantom twitch. "Why?" he asked. "Why care for the lair of the beast that holds you captive?" Ariadne looked up, meeting his gaze. "Because a cage is still a place where someone lives," she said softly. "And no one should have to live in the dark." Sebastian stared at her for a long moment, the air between them thick and charged. He looked at the dust smudged on her cheek, the determination in her soft chin. "You are a strange wolf, Ariadne," he murmured. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face. For a second she thought he might touch her, wipe away the dust, but his hand dropped. "If you must be useful," he said gruffly, turning away, "then light the fire, the cold in this room. It settles in the bones." He walked to the desk and sat down, pulling a map toward him. He didn't tell her to leave. Ariadne let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She went to the hearth, arranged the logs, and struck the flint. As the flames caught, casting a warm glow over the room, she saw the Alpha King relax just a fraction, his shoulders lowering as the warmth reached him. She stayed, and for the first time, the silence wasn't empty. It was shared. The truce between them was fragile, built on the quiet moments in the library. Ariadne learned that Sebastian was not merely a brute. He was a scholar, a strategist, a king burdened by a kingdom of ghosts. He read ancient texts in languages she didn't recognize, searching for something he never found. But the peace broke on the night of the full moon. It started with a tension in the air, a static charge that made the hair on Ariadne's arms stand up. Sebastian was nowhere to be found. The castle felt like the inside of a drum waiting to be struck. Dinner, a tray of roast pheasant and bread left outside her door by an unseen servant, went untouched. The howling wind outside seemed to have a voice tonight, mocking and cruel. Then she heard it. A crash, a roar that shook the stone foundations of the tower. It came from the west wing, the forbidden wing. Fear told her to lock her door and hide under the covers. But something else, a pull she couldn't explain, deeper than logic, drew her to the door. That roar hadn't sounded like anger. It sounded like agony. She grabbed a heavy iron candlestick for a weapon and stepped into the hallway. The corridor to the west wing was dark, the torches extinguished. The air grew colder with every step, smelling of ozone and raw magic. She reached the heavy double doors at the end of the hall. One was hanging off its hinges, the wood splintered. "Sebastian!" she called out, her voice trembling. Inside, the room was a wreck. Furniture had been reduced to matchsticks. The tapestries were shredded. In the center of the room, amidst the debris, crouched the beast. He was half-shifted, a monstrous hybrid of man and wolf. His hands were claws, his spine hunched and distorted, his jaw elongated. He was panting, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was fighting himself, his human mind warring with the ancient cursed instinct to destroy. He snapped his head toward her. His eyes were entirely gold, no pupil visible. He snarled, saliva dripping from his fangs. "Get out!" The voice was a gurgle, layers of human speech and animal growl grinding together. Ariadne should have run. Every survival instinct screamed at her to flee. But she saw the way his claws were digging into the stone floor, anchoring himself, fighting the urge to lunge. He was protecting her from himself. She set the candlestick down. No, she said. Her voice was quiet but steady. I will kill you, he rasped, his body seizing with a spasm of transformation. You won't, she said, taking a step forward. You are the king. You command the shadows. You command yourself. She walked toward him, navigating the broken glass on the floor. The beast roared, swiping at the air, trying to scare her back. Ariadne didn't flinch. She stopped just out of reach of his claws. Look at me, she commanded, channeling an authority she didn't know she possessed. Sebastian, look at me. The name seemed to hit him like a physical blow. The beast blinked. The gold in his eyes swirled, revealing a speck of human darkness in the center. Ariadne knelt on the floor, disregarding the glass cutting into her knees. She began to hum. It was a lullaby her mother had sung to her, a simple melody about the moon watching over the lost. The low, melodic sound cut through the violence of the room. Sebastian's growls subsided into whimpers. His body shuddered, the bones cracking as they realigned, the fur receding. It was a gruesome, painful process, but Ariadne didn't look away. She kept humming, pouring all her empathy, all her own sorrow and hope into the sound. Slowly, the monster faded. Sebastian collapsed onto the floor, fully human, naked and shivering, his skin slick with sweat and blood. Ariadne moved then. She pulled the velvet throw from a shredded sofa and draped it over him. She sat beside him, not touching him, just offering her presence as an anchor. Sebastian's breathing slowed. He turned his head, his cheek resting on the cold stone, looking at her with eyes that were exhausted and devastatingly human. Why? He rasped, his voice raw. Why didn't you run? Ariadne reached out and brushed a lock of damp hair from his forehead. The contact sent a jolt through her, not of static this time, but of warmth, a tether. Because everyone has run from you, she whispered, and I know how much it hurts to watch people leave. Sebastian closed his eyes. For the first time, he didn't pull away. He leaned into her hand, just for a second, a surrender more profound than any battle he had ever lost. The morning after the transformation, the dynamic shifted. Sebastian was no longer just her captor. He was a man she had seen at his most vulnerable, and she was no longer a stray. She was the one who had sung the beast to sleep. The blizzard finally broke 3 days later. The sun emerged, blindingly bright, turning the world into a sculpture of ice and diamonds. Sebastian stood in the courtyard, fully armored in black leather and chainmail. He was checking the saddle of a massive black stallion. The animal was as temperamental as its master, snapping at the grooms, but it stood still for him. The pass is open, Sebastian said as Ariadne approached. He didn't look at her, focusing on tightening a strap. I'm riding to the border. There are disturbances. Disturbances? Ariadne asked, wrapping her shawl tighter. Scouts, he said grimly. Wolves from the south. They are testing the perimeter. Ariadne's stomach dropped. My old pack? Perhaps. He swung himself into the saddle. Stay inside the walls, Ariadne. If the wards fall, I cannot protect you out here. He rode out with a dozen of his shadow guards, silent, lethal warriors who seemed to materialize from the darkness of the barracks. Ariadne went to the highest tower. She couldn't sit in the library today. She watched the black specks of the riders move against the white expanse of the valley. Hours passed. The sun began to dip, painting the snow in shades of violet and bruised orange. Then she saw it. A flare of red light near the tree line, magic, and the distinct echoing howl of a wolf in pain. Ariadne didn't think. She ran. She ran down the winding stairs, through the great hall, and out into the courtyard. The heavy gates were barred, but there was a sally port, small and unguarded. She slipped through, her boots crunching on the frozen crust of the snow. She shouldn't be doing this. She was weak. She had no claws, no combat training, but the bond, that strange new tether to the Alpha King, was pulling at her, sharp and urgent. Danger. He is in danger. She crested the ridge overlooking the valley entrance. The snow was stained crimson. The battle was chaotic. Sebastian was a blur of motion, his sword flashing, fighting 3 wolves in gray fur, silver moon warriors. She recognized the colors, but it was a trap. While Sebastian fought the 3, a 4th wolf, massive and brindle-furred, was flanking him, creeping through the shadows of the tree line, aiming for his exposed back. Behind you! Ariadne screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. Sebastian spun around just as the brindlewolf lunged. He caught the beast mid-air, his sword driving upward, but the wolf's momentum knocked him from his horse. They crashed into the snow in a tangle of limbs and steel. Sebastian roared, his own wolf rising to the surface, his eyes glowing. He threw the carcass of the brindlewolf aside, but he was limping. Blood, bright and arterial, welled from a gash in his thigh. The remaining 3 wolves circled him. They sensed blood. They sensed weakness. "Leave him!" The voice was thin, terrified but piercing. Ariadne slid down the ridge, stumbling into the fray. She grabbed a fallen branch, a useless twig against shifters, but she wielded it like a spear. The silver moon wolves paused, confused by the sudden appearance of a small, fragile Omega in a torn dress. One of them shifted. It was a man Ariadne recognized, Marcus, one of Charles's lieutenants. He sneered, his mouth bloody. "The reject," Marcus laughed, a wet, hacking sound. "We wondered where the trash had blown to. Step aside, girl. The Alpha wants the king's head." "No," Ariadne said, planting her feet. She stood between the wounded king and the killers. Her heart was a hummingbird in her chest, but her eyes were dry. "You will not touch him." "Ariadne, move!" Sebastian growled from the snow behind her. His voice was strained with pain. "Run!" "I am done running," she said. Marcus snarled. "Then die with him." He lunged. Ariadne flinched, bracing for the teeth, but they never came. A shadow, blacker than night, colder than death, erupted from the ground. It wasn't Sebastian. It was the land itself answering the king's distress. Tendrils of darkness shot up, wrapping around Marcus's legs, dragging him down with a terrifying shriek. Sebastian forced himself up. He didn't use his sword. He grabbed the second wolf by the throat with his bare hand and squeezed, the sound of crushing windpipe echoing in the valley. The third wolf turned and fled, tail tucked. Silence fell, heavy and absolute. Sebastian stood swaying, blood soaking his trousers. He looked at the dead men, then he turned his burning gaze to Ariadne. He looked terrifying, a god of war covered in gore. He took a step toward her and stumbled. Ariadne caught him. He was heavy, collapsing against her, his heat searing through her clothes. They sank to the snow together. "You foolish girl," he whispered, his head resting on her shoulder, his breathing shallow. "You foolish, brave girl." Ariadne pressed her hands to his wound, the hot blood covering her fingers. She didn't feel sick. She felt fierce. "I've got you," she whispered, the cold wind whipping her hair around them like a shroud. "I've got you, Sebastian." And in the blood-soaked snow, with the king of nightmares bleeding in her arms, Ariadne Whitmore finally realized she was no longer invisible. She was the only thing keeping the king alive. The return to the castle was a blur of shadows and pain. The shadow guards, silent as the grave, had emerged from the tree line moments after the battle ended, carrying their fallen king on a litter of woven darkness. Ariadne walked beside him, her hand gripping his cold one, refusing to let go even when the castle gates groaned open to swallow them. They laid him on the great table in the library, the only room that felt like theirs. The wound on Sebastian's thigh was deep, the flesh torn by poisoned claws. He was burning with fever, his skin radiating a terrifying heat that seemed to warp the air around him. The local healer, an elderly woman named Alara who smelled of dried sage and fear, shook her head as she examined him. "The poison is ancient," Alara whispered, her hands trembling. "Wolfsbane mixed with grave dust. It binds to the wolf's spirit. I can stitch the flesh, child, but I cannot anchor the soul." "Do what you can," Ariadne commanded, her voice ringing with a steel she hadn't possessed a week ago. "I will do the rest." For 3 days and 3 nights, Ariadne did not sleep. She became the keeper of the king's breath. She bathed his forehead with snowmelt. She forced willow bark tea between his cracked lips. And she talked to him. She told him about the flowers she would plant in the courtyard when the snow melted. She told him about the books she had organized. She told him, in hushed whispers, about the day she was rejected, not with bitterness, but as a story of how she found her way to him. On the 4th night, the fever broke. Ariadne was dozing in a chair beside the table, her head resting on her arms when she felt a touch on her hair. Light, hesitant like a moth landing on a petal, she jerked awake. Sebastian was watching her. His eyes were clear, the molten gold cooled to a warm, rich amber. He looked exhausted, his cheekbones sharp as blades, but he was present. "You stayed," he he rasped, his voice a wreck of gravel. "I told you," Ariadne whispered, her throat tight. "I am done running." Sebastian shifted, wincing as the stitches pulled. He reached out and took her hand. His grip was weak, but the current that passed between them was undeniable, a steady, humming vibration that settled deep in her marrow. It was not the shallow, frantic pull she had felt for Charles. This was different. This was gravity. "Ariadne," he said, and the way he said her name made it sound like a prayer. "Do you know what you have done by saving me, by defying a pack alpha to protect a rogue king?" "I did what was right," she said. "No," Sebastian corrected, his thumb brushing over her pulse point. "You did what a mate does." The word hung in the silence of the library, heavy and absolute. Ariadne's breath hitched. "But I was rejected. My bond is broken." "Your bond with him was a mistake of geography," Sebastian murmured, his eyes searching hers. "The moon goddess does not make mistakes, but she does enjoy irony. She sent you to be broken so that you could be rebuilt here, with me." He pulled her closer, his strength returning in a surge of need. Ariadne went willingly, leaning over him until their foreheads touched. She could smell the scent of him, clean snow, dark wood, and the underlying spicy note of the alpha. It didn't make her want to submit, it made her want to stand beside him. "I am a monster, Ariadne," he whispered against her skin. "I am the villain in every story your people tell. I have nothing to offer you but a frozen kingdom and a cursed bloodline." "Then I will thaw the kingdom," she replied, her lips brushing his, "and we will rewrite the stories." He kissed her then. It was not a gentle kiss, it was a claiming. It tasted of survival and fever and desperate, terrifying hope. In the quiet of the library, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, the shy Omega died, and a queen began to rise. Spring came to the Deadlands not with flowers, but with war. The snow had receded to the peaks of the mountains, revealing the jagged black rocks and the hardy gray grass of the valley. But along with the thaw came the banners of the Silver Moon Pack. They arrived at dawn, a column of 50 wolves marching up the winding road to Blackwood Castle. At the head of the column rode Charles Kingsbury. He looked magnificent in polished silver armor, his golden hair gleaming, a sharp contrast to the stark, dark reality of Sebastian's domain. Beside him rode Valeria, looking smug and lethal. Ariadne stood on the battlements beside Sebastian. He was fully healed, though he walked with a slight, predatory limp. He wore no armor, only his black leathers and the heavy fur cloak. He didn't need steel to look like a king. "They have come for the land," Sebastian said, his eyes scanning the enemy lines. "They think I am weak. They heard the rumors of the poisoned wound." "They didn't come for the land," Ariadne said quietly, her gaze fixed on Charles. "He came for his ego." A horn blasted from the valley floor. "Sebastian Ravensford!" Charles's voice was amplified by magic, booming against the stone walls. "You harbor a fugitive of the Silver Moon Pack. Surrender the Omega Ariadne Whitmore, and we will leave your cursed rocks in peace." Sebastian went rigid. A low growl started deep in his chest, vibrating through the stone beneath Ariadne's feet. "He wants you back?" Sebastian asked, his voice deadly calm. "He doesn't want me," Ariadne said, realizing the truth with crystal clarity. "He wants to verify that I am miserable. He cannot stand the idea that I might have survived him." "Shall we go down and correct him?" Sebastian offered a hand. Ariadne looked at the hand of the beast who had kept her warm, the hand of the king who had bowed to her strength. She took it. "Yes," she said. "Let's." They descended to the courtyard. The massive iron gates groaned open. Sebastian and Ariadne walked out alone to meet the army. Charles sat high on his horse, looking down at them. When he saw Ariadne, his eyes widened. She was not the cowering girl in the gray dress he had banished. She wore a gown of deep midnight blue velvet, tailored to fit the curves she had stopped hiding. Her hair was braided with silver thread, and around her neck hung a heavy pendant of obsidian, the king's mark. She held her head high, her gaze steady. "Ariadne," Charles said, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "You look... well..." "Charles," she greeted, her voice cool and carrying. "You look lost. The border is 10 miles south." Valeria snarled, urging her horse forward. "Watch your tongue, Omega. We are here to offer you mercy. Come back, kneel before your Alpha, and you may be allowed to serve in the kitchens. It is better than rotting in this tomb." Sebastian laughed. It was a dark, dry sound. "Rotting? My dear, she is not rotting. She is ruling." Charles's face turned red. "She is a rejected mate. She is damaged goods. She belongs to Silver Moon by birthright." "I belong to myself," Ariadne interrupted, stepping forward, releasing Sebastian's hand to stand alone. "And you threw me away, Charles. You made it very clear in front of the entire pack. The moon goddess makes mistakes, you said." She took a breath, drawing in the crisp mountain air. "You were right. She made a mistake in pairing us, because you were never strong enough to handle me." The Silver Moon warriors shifted uneasily. To hear an Omega speak this way to an Alpha was heresy. But Ariadne didn't feel like an Omega anymore. She felt like the storm that had broken the winter. "I claim her," Charles shouted, his ego snapping. He dismounted, drawing his sword. "By the laws of the packs, I challenge for her return." Sebastian stepped in front of Ariadne. The shadows around him lengthened, twisting into claws. "No," Ariadne said, placing a hand on Sebastian's chest. "He is not worth your sword, my love." She turned to Charles. "You want a challenge? Look at me, Charles. Look at the bond." She dropped her mental shields, the ones she had used to hide her pain. She let the new bond, the golden iron-strong tether connecting her to Sebastian, flare to life. It hit Charles like a physical wave. He staggered back, gasping. He felt the power of it. It wasn't the weak, subservient bond of a rejected mate. It was a true mate bond, forged in fire and blood, sealed by the acceptance of two souls who had seen the worst in each other, and stayed. She is mated," Charles whispered, horror dawning in his eyes. To reject a mate was one thing. To realize you had rejected a queen who was destined for a king was a humiliation that would end his leadership. "Go home, Charles," Ariadne said softly. "There is nothing for you here but snow and regret." The retreat of the Silver Moon Pack was not a march. It was a slinking away. Charles mounted his horse, unable to meet Ariadne's eyes, and turned south without another word. His authority was shattered, not by a sword, but by the simple, undeniable truth of Ariadne's happiness. As the last banner disappeared around the bend, Sebastian turned to Ariadne. The adrenaline of the confrontation was fading, replaced by a raw, intense focus. "You called me my love," he said. His voice was low, barely audible over the wind, yet it carried the weight of a boulder. He didn't ask it like a question, he said it like a discovery, turning the words over in his mouth to taste them. Ariadne looked up at him. The wind whipped strands of her hair across her face, but she didn't brush them away. She didn't want to look away from him for even a second. "I did." He stepped closer, invading her space in the way only he could, not to intimidate, but to encompass. "Did you mean it? Or was it a weapon to wound him?" "I don't use love as a weapon, Sebastian," Ariadne said softly. She reached out, tracing the sharp line of his jaw, the roughness of his stubble against her fingertips. "And I don't lie. Not anymore. Not to myself, and certainly not to you." He closed his eyes at her touch, a shudder running through his massive frame. For a moment, he looked infinitely weary, the centuries of isolation etching themselves onto his features. Then, he opened his eyes, and the golden fire within them burned with a terrifying vulnerability. "There is one more law," he said, his voice raspy, as if the words were being dragged over shards of glass. "The one they don't write in the nursery rhymes, the curse on this land. It wasn't just punishment for a war. It was a mirror." He turned to look at the castle behind them, the fortress of obsidian that had been his prison, his sanctuary, his tomb. "It was placed on my bloodline because we were believed to be heartless, beasts incapable of anything but hunger and rage. The witch who cast it said that the ice would only melt when a mate, one fully aware of the monster within, chose to stay. Not out of duty, not out of fear, but out of love." He looked back at her, his expression intense enough to bruise. "I never thought it would break. I thought I was destined to be the last winter." Slowly, with a solemnity that made Ariadne's heart ache, he knelt in the snow. It was the second time the Wolf King had knelt for her. The first had been in blood and desperation. This time, it was an act of reverence. He reached into the pocket of his leather coat and pulled out a ring. It was not gold or silver. It was a band of black iron, hammered and rough, ancient and unyielding. Set into the dark metal was a raw diamond, uncut, jagged, catching the weak sunlight and fracturing it into 1,000 prisms of color. "This was my mother's," he said, his voice thick. "She died wearing it, fighting to protect this land. It is not a pretty thing, Ariadne. It is heavy. It carries the weight of a cursed history. It promises no ease, no balls in lighted halls, no soft life." He looked up at her, holding the ring out with a hand that trembled slightly. "Ariadne Whitmore, will you take this crown of thorns and ice? Will you take this beast, with all his scars and his silence, and make him a man?" Ariadne looked at the ring, then at the man kneeling before her. She saw the boy he had been, lonely and misunderstood. She saw the king he was, fierce and protective, and she saw the partner he would be. "I don't want a soft life, Sebastian," she whispered, her voice trembling with the sheer magnitude of her emotion. "I want a real one." She reached out, her hand steady. "I will take the man, and I will keep the beast, too. I happen to love him." Sebastian slid the ring onto her finger. It was cold against her skin, heavy and substantial. But the moment it settled at the base of her finger, the cold vanished. A spark, hot and electric, jumped from the metal into her vein. A deep, resonant tremor ran through the ground beneath their feet. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a heartbeat. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere of the Deadlands, the feeling of being watched by invisible, hostile eyes, shattered like glass. A bird began to sing. A single, high, clear trill from the top of the gatehouse. It was a sound so foreign, so impossibly sweet, that it brought tears to Ariadne's eyes. Sebastian stood. He didn't speak. He couldn't. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, breathing her in as if she were the only oxygen in the world. He lowered his head to the crook of her neck, to the sensitive, pulse-fluttering spot where the mating mark belonged. "Mine," he growled, the vibration rumbling against her chest. The wolf surfaced, not to destroy, but to claim what had been denied for so long. "Yours," she whispered, tilting her head back, baring her soul to him. "Always." His teeth grazed her skin, sharp and possessive, testing, asking one final time. Ariadne gripped his coat, pulling him closer, a silent demand. He bit down. The pain was sharp, a flash of white-hot lightning that seared through her nerves. But it was fleeting, instantly replaced by a flood of euphoria so intense her knees buckled. Their souls slammed together. It was no longer two separate entities standing in the snow. It was a fusion. She felt his grief, his centuries of loneliness, washing away in the tide of her acceptance. He felt her pain, her rejection, healing in the fire of his devotion. They were a single woven tapestry of gold and shadow. The energy of the bond rippled outward from them, a visible shockwave of golden magic that swept across the courtyard and over the walls. Where the magic touched, the world changed. The snow didn't just melt, it evaporated into a mist that smelled of rain and rich earth. Around them, through the thawing black mud, green shoots punched through the surface with aggressive vitality. The twisted, dead pillars of the trees in the valley shuddered and straightened, their black bark lightening to a healthy gray-brown, buds swelling and bursting into leaves in the span of seconds. The gray sky tore open, the heavy clouds dissolving to reveal an expanse of brilliant, impossible blue. The curse broke. It didn't end with a battle cry or a spell. It ended with a surrender. It ended with a promise kept. Sebastian pulled back, his chest heaving, his eyes shining with tears he refused to shed but could no longer hide. He looked around at the valley, watching the gray fade into a vibrant, living green. He watched the waterfall on the distant cliff, frozen for 100 years, crash down in a roar of white foam. He looked back at Ariadne, looking at her with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. "You did this," he whispered. Ariadne smiled, reaching up to cup his face, her thumb brushing away a single tear that had escaped. "We did this," she corrected. He laughed then. It was a sound that started deep in his belly and erupted into the air, a sound of pure freedom. He scooped her up into his arms, spinning her around in the center of the blooming courtyard, the petals of new wildflowers swirling around them like confetti. "Long live the queen," he said, pressing his forehead to hers, the king of a winter that had finally ended. Epilogue. The First Flower. 5 years later. The valley of Blackwood was no longer a place of nursery rhyme terrors. It was a sanctuary. The village at the base of the castle had grown, populated by rogues and outcasts who sought the protection of the Wolf King and his gentle queen. Ariadne sat in the castle garden, a space that was once a graveyard of stone, now a riot of lavender and wild roses. A small boy, barely 4 years old, with messy black hair and eyes the color of warm honey, toddled toward her. He was holding something in his chubby fist. "Mama, look!" Ariadne smiled, reaching out to scoop him onto her lap. "What did you find, Leo?" He opened his hand. Resting on his palm was a snowdrop, delicate, white, and perfect. "It was in the snow," Leo said solemnly. "Daddy said it's brave." "It is very brave," Ariadne agreed, kissing the top of his head. A shadow fell over them. Sebastian stood there, leaning against the trellis. Time had been kind to him. The harsh lines of his face had softened, smoothed by laughter and peace. He looked at his son and his mate, and the love in his eyes was fierce enough to burn down the world. "He has your nose," Sebastian said, reaching down to tickle Leo, who shrieked with delight. "He has your stubbornness," Ariadne countered, leaning back into Sebastian's touch as he stroked her hair. "He is a king in the making," Sebastian murmured. He looked out over the valley where the smoke from hearth fires rose into the twilight sky. "Just as you were a queen in hiding." Ariadne looked at the snowdrop in her son's hand. A survivor, just like her. "No," she said softly, taking Sebastian's hand and pressing it to her cheek. "I wasn't hiding, Sebastian. I was just waiting for the winter to end." In the end, Ariadne's rejection was not a tragedy, but a redirection of fate. The pain that hollowed her out carved the space for a love that was vast enough to fill a kingdom. She and Sebastian proved that broken things are not useless. They are simply waiting to be put together in a different way. Their love story became a legend, not of conquest, but of healing. A testament that even in the deepest winter, beneath the hardest ice, life waits for the right kind of warmth. They did not just survive the cold, they became the fire that ended it, ruling not by fear, but by the unbreakable, defiant power of a choice made in the dark.